Hello, my name is Piret Tenorist. I work for the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation at the OECD, and I lead the work on anticipatory innovation governance, system thinking, and innovation measurement. The Observatory is there for the OECD countries and beyond to collect the emerging practice of what is going on in the field of public sector innovation, and that is something that I'm going to talk about today. Over these days during the Creative Bureaucracy Festival, you are going to talk with your peers around four different topics around thinking afresh, working differently, capturing new opportunities for change, and sustaining the mood for change as well. So, we at the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation do a lot of thinking around those topics and actually analyze what the new trends within the public sector innovation field are connected to those four discussion points. And of course, coming out of the pandemic, public sector innovation is on everybody's mind. It's one of the most core topics about how we dealt with the crisis itself, but are we actually going to come out of the crisis? And what we take from it from a kind of a longer perspective as well. So today, I'm going to present you with a top 10 list of public sector innovation challenges that governments, at least for the upcoming years, will in one way or other come across or start working on. Some countries are already working on these challenges, some are starting their innovation journeys, but I think that this in the personal list of these are the things that will be on top of mind of many public sector innovators and also kind of the system stewards of public sector innovation systems to come. So let's get started. First of all and foremost, what we have seen happening in the last years is that public sector innovation is becoming more institutionalized. It is becoming more professional. We are thinking afresh about what public sector innovation systems actually look like. What are the elements of these systems and how they should be actually steered, created, and what the specific roles are. We're not talking anymore about very specific structural solutions or organizational solutions, like if we need an innovation lab or not, just because of having a lab. We're actually talking about the roles of what such a lab should have within the broader system that allows public sector employees and their partners to innovate in a systematic manner. So we are going beyond these kind of one-time organizational solutions and thinking what will fit into decentralized or more centralized public sector systems and what these different roles are. So who is setting the strategic vision about where public sector innovation is most needed? Do we need a strategy for that to actually happen? Does it fit within our political system? How it fits with substantive policy goals and how do we make it happen? How does public sector innovation fit within recruitment policies, HR policies, and the connected different activities? And also, how are different roles played as well? Which organizations allow us to bring about new questions? How do we make sense of new trends? And how do we actually find synergies within the broader system itself? So public sector shouldn't be only the sum of individual parts, but we should also look at it all together. And this brings me to the second point of how to actually operationally do that. So more and more in the last years, we at the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation at the OECD, but also other international bodies leading on public sector innovation, have been talking about portfolio management. So this is really about working differently, concretely in the public sector. So when I talked about the institutionalization of innovation within the public sector itself, then actually having a portfolio mindset about the different activities we are putting towards innovation is extremely important. So it actually allows us to go beyond a trend that we see everywhere in the public sector, which is projectization. Everything becomes a project. We make linear causal processes from bigger programs, challenges, and goals, when they become manageable projects that we can finance, that we can build business cases around. But in the end, we don't actually know, do we have ever reached the outcomes and the substantive goals that we set out to do? So how do we know that we are actually serving those purposes? And in the innovation field as well, that contributes to the substantive goals of government, we also need to see, are those projects, investments actually paying out? So we need to also have innovation portfolio management and innovation portfolio management tools that allow us to look at those different activities together and see, does innovation help us in terms of to adapt to change, reach our missions, enhance and make the public sector as a whole more productive, or also anticipate change in practice. And currently, these public sector innovation portfolio tools do not exist. We rely very much on private sector experiences, which are more investment driven and sometimes also concentrating on specific projects or R&D investments specifically. And this is not going to be enough for public sector. So we need kind of new tools and efforts that help us to actually look at how we achieve within our portfolios, with our innovation portfolios, the public values that we want to see in practice. And that allows us to also take more risks and also accept failure, because if we can evaluate on a portfolio level our performance, and the overall performance of our portfolio, then it doesn't really matter that we're taking more risks with specific projects. And that is extremely important in the public sector context, where risk aversion has been an issue for quite some time. And this leads me to the third point that I want to make, or the third challenge that is going to be on the top of the mind, and quite a big one for many public sector employees and beyond, which is called missions. Missions, missions, missions. The COVID-19 crisis has brought about many windows of opportunity to actually raise issues connected to climate change, green transition, and also outlined many challenges that we see in practice in our welfare system, within our healthcare system, and so on. So actually, how do we make those missions happen? And that requires, going back to the second point, also working differently. So we also need mission portfolio approaches. So we don't scatter our activities or fragment our activities, that we actually reach the challenges that we want to reach. So we need to have tools and methods and also evaluation modes connected to those missions that we are setting out to achieve. And missions are a great enhancers of innovation within the public sector, as long as we don't lead by solution, we lead by a problem. And anything goes. As long as we get to that moon, as long as we get to that goal, you can innovate as much as possible, try out things as much as possible, but we will also control that you actually achieve that challenge or goal, or that mission, that purpose that you wanted to achieve. But that will also create organizational challenges, and it's already creating organizational challenges within the public sector. So to deal with missions, to look at innovation portfolios, and also institutionalize public sector innovation, we need to tackle silos and different structural elements of government that the government is currently working in. So we will also need to think about how to work in a very practical manner on a mission or a phenomenon-based approach across government, that different experts from different fields, where they can contribute to the mission that we want to achieve, can actually do so, and do not get caught up in organizational budgets, organizational mobility structures, recruitment structures, or workforce structures that inhibit them to actually do the work that they need to do. So these are the kind of cascading challenges, and doing things differently and thinking about government challenges differently will bring about in practice to your field. And that really brings me to the fourth point, or fourth challenge that is upcoming, which is really about the implementation of innovation. And that is something that has not really gotten a lot of traction or interest before, because we tend to talk about big policy challenges and even policy innovations. And then we go and skip quite a lot of space within government and go straight to the agency level or the local level where we're talking about operational things, operational projects or working methods about how to do things. But the implementation journey from a vision or a strategy and how to innovate, for example, should also take into account the feedback loops between the two processes. It's very, very challenging that there is a myth within the public sector that policy is made separately from implementation. And especially during the COVID crisis now and the pandemic, we have seen that in complex challenges, this is not the case. We're going more towards real-time policymaking, where we make choices and innovate, but not everything is going to work out because the change is extremely expedient. And on the other side, we don't know what is going to work in practice and not before we actually implement that. So how do we have that feedback loop in place where we can really learn from innovations on the ground in practice on an ongoing basis and take that into account into the policy making as well? So embedding these kind of policy innovation experiments into the scale of implementation, working on scale, diffusing those processes, how do those fit together? So another great challenge for the public sector to come. And this requires us, as a fifth point as well, to bust some silos. So maybe silos have come up already in terms of the previous points where I was talking about the implementation and missions and others. But I have a couple of, under the fifth point, a couple of specific silos that governments need to address in the public sector context. And those specifically are the silos of futures and foresight, but also the silo of evidence-based policymaking. So in your government or the public sector, do the public sector innovators work closely together with futurists and foresight people? Or do they also work together with evidence-based colleagues who are actually continuously collecting from RCTs and other ways of studies evidence about what works and what doesn't work? In our experience, working together with the countries, those fields are very much disconnected from innovation and innovators in government. So strategic foresight has a very big impact gap. We saw it in the crisis as well, that the foresight contributes to risk assessment, but then it stays there. We have pandemics listed as one of the top challenges in different countries. We have different scenarios for adverse effects, but it doesn't mean that anything is done about that, that we actually take those scenarios seriously and into account in terms of innovating, that we have structures in place that help us tackle these challenges in reality. And really, the same goes for the evidence-based policymaking clusters as well. It doesn't mean that something that we know that potentially works, that it will work actually in practice. There's a huge gap in terms of using evidence and scaling up processes. Because even if we know, based on tests or experiments, that something potentially works, it doesn't mean that it's going to be affordable for government to actually implement. So there are many things that we need to actually innovate towards across those silos, connecting to innovation practices within the public sector to make it work in practice. So we need to have those value chains that specifically connect also futures and foresight to innovation practices within the public sector, but also create those linkages with evidence-based bodies, because there's need to actually make change in practice and implement new approaches requires innovation. So coming to the sixth point as well is that we are now broadening the scope of people that need to work on innovation. So my sixth agenda point definitely is going to be who is allowed to innovate within the government context. And this is another big trend that is upcoming that we see happening, is the rising wave of innovation management support, kind of professionalization of innovation on individual teams and organization levels within government. So this has been also been pushed forward by the ISO group and the standardization process, where new standards have come out, both for the similar for public sector and private sector innovation together, about what public sector and private sector innovation management actually looks like. What does it entail? There are both positive and negative sides to that, because innovation processes notoriously cannot be standardized. But it is a very interesting and relevant process to actually say, how do we support our workforce, and which modules and ways do we support our workforce in these innovative practices within the public sector itself? And one of the leading countries in this is Sweden. They have also, from their innovation agency, programs in place for different types of innovation and organizational needs that those organizations may need for the support of innovative practices. And there are, of course, many challenges that arise. We, first of all, in the first kind of maturity level, want to support individual innovation capacity. Then we also want to support organizational level and leadership level innovation capacity to actually deal with those challenges. But on the other hand, we also want to support ongoing innovation practices. So innovation management becomes embedded in organizations. So we need to potentially support missions and mission level activities in terms of training and support and the tools and methods they need in different ways. And Winnow is currently experimenting with those things. And we have also had the pleasure from the OECD side to do a meta-evaluation of the process, and hopefully we'll have a report out soon on the topic as well. And that brings me to the seventh point on the list of 10 that is going to be on the minds of government officials and public sector employees, which is the topic of evaluation. And I feel that we have been talking about the topic of public sector innovation evaluation forever. How to do that well, how to demonstrate that we are actually making an effort. But based on the previous argument on innovation management, I think also the needs for public sector evaluation are becoming more specific. We're not going to talk about overall evaluation methods for innovation, but specifically setting up, for example, big mission-oriented innovation programs. We want to also have specific evaluation methods for those missions and for those innovations that contribute to missions, or that allow us to evaluate innovation portfolios in government to find those synergies, and does the portfolio actually work in terms of, on an organizational level, managing the risk and uncertainties of the organization and bringing up new potential, new ways of doing things and thinking about things, but also on an ecosystem level. So public sector usually cannot do these kind of transformations alone. So we also need to look at our portfolios or activities about what our other actors and our partners within the system are doing. And does that joint portfolio contribute to those public values that we see in action? So very specific and different and also difficult needs for the field of public sector innovation evaluation in its reality. On the eighth point, and definitely one of my favorite topics, one of the upcoming things is, of course, that I hinted at on this kind of busting silos point before, is also the future-ready and anticipatory governance within the context of the public sector. So there is a lot to actually untie on this one, because the pandemic itself has shown really the need for those kind of capacity and action and those kind of value chains that I mentioned before, from futures, foresight to actual innovation activity and the learning group back. Those capacities currently are missing within the public sector at large, and we need to have different models and support system and more knowledge about how to actually make it work within the public sector system. because we also know that doing exploration and exploitation activities, both in the public sector and private sector, is difficult. Even biggest corporations and most innovative organizations in the private sector as well are struggling with this due to natural processes that happen within the public within organizations, because you tend to prefer the status quo, and there's always risk aversion and the fear of change. So how to tackle that? So we are working together currently with the government of Finland towards a new anticipatory innovation governance model that takes also public sector innovation challenges into account. We're working together with Ireland in developing different capacity building models with different levels of government, in terms of the most senior leaders towards the policy experts and implementers on the ground, of what they actually need to know or have the knowledge about on both fields around innovation and also futures and foresight, to join up those activities so we can actually take action, not only talk about the future, but influence it in the present. So bringing those challenges into the present and into the exploration process, etc. And this is going to be extremely important in the new upcoming challenges that are coming up, which is the ninth point that I'm trying to make, is concerning the cascading effects of technology. Pandemics, climate change, and many other challenges are going to bring us so many different kind of future-oriented, uncertain things that we need to actually have anticipatory innovation in place within government. And one of those is, of course, the cascading effects of technology, and that we're actually reaching the stage of where we're not only looking at the technology itself and how to integrate that into the public sector, but we actually have to look at its effects in terms of social interaction. So technology will start to influence also how we live, in which way we live, way we work. So this was accelerated to the pandemic. But the digitalization process, the digital transformation, is just at the beginning curve. It will actually become bigger and bigger effects that not only in the public sector and using technology we have to take into account, but also how the society takes up technology and starts to implement that. And these are effects that we actually need to take into account before they become scaled up, diffused within the system itself, because they're going to challenge the architectural cornerstones of what public sector actually deals with and what our public services are connected to. And then on, last but not least, the 10th point of things that in terms of public sector innovation we have to take into account is, of course, the lasting effects of the pandemic itself and COVID-19. And I'm sure in the rest of the festival, you're going to hear a lot of arguments and discussion around those topics. So I'm going to raise one of the issues that I see happening in the next year, or already is happening in the public sector innovation space as well, is that we're getting a little bit tired, that we also, in terms of the mood for change, we have to take into account innovation fatigue, that we have to think about actively how to keep those innovation activities going, because we have been running on speed for the last year and a half and upcoming year times as well. And the cascading effects of the crisis are still upcoming. So can we actually keep the momentum going? Can we keep the opportunities to innovate within the public sector open, and how to do it in practice? So this is the last thing of the 10 different challenges I wanted to keep you in mind. And now as well, you're going to see the full list of the top 10 challenges that I've mentioned before. Thank you so much for your attention, and hope you have a very productive, interesting festival to come. Thank you.